This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you wonderful people out there. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, living in the United States of America. Today, you join us again to listen to Leadership Excellence for Impact and how to lead like Mandela today, as well as sharing people's untold Mandela moments. Today, I'm joined by a remarkable human being, an inspirational leader. He has been a mentor, and I'm privileged to say also a friend. We have Professor Mervyn King, who is based in South Africa. He is a former judge of the South African Supreme Court. He is a corporate attorney who has served on the boards of multi-listed companies in London, Luxembourg, and South Africa. He is an author, a professor, and a champion of change who has made a huge impact in the world around the issues of international reporting standards, good corporate governance, leadership responsibility, and solid citizenship. It is with great honor and privilege I welcome Professor Mervyn King. It's a great privilege just to have you chat to us today, Mervyn, about some of the topics of passion that you've dedicated your life to in the world. And just thank you so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to see you.
My pleasure, and lovely to see you again.
Share with us your most recent work in the world, the amazing work you've done around corporate governance, leadership responsibility, and solid citizenship. Can you share with us just what that's about, the work you've done, and the difference it's made?
Well, yes. Back in the 20th century, towards the end of the 20th century, it was realized and empirically established that companies in the main, and you and I as individuals to a much lesser extent, were using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating them. Clearly not a sustainable matter. Mm-hmm. And consequently, the dictate of the primacy of the shareholder of Milton Friedman, that the sole purpose of the company was to make profit, even though it was subsidized by society and the environment. And we had a century of unsustainable development. In the first decade of the 21st century, the GRI was started in Boston, strangely enough, and moved to Amsterdam.
Yes.
And I became chair, and I was also chair of the United Nations on Governance and Oversight. And it was there that really I got a deep understanding of the critical state that our planet was in, and what would happen if we as corporate leaders didn't change the way we led and the way we steered our companies. Of course, direct comes from the Latin word to steer.
Yeah.
And so I became very involved in setting standards for what were the impacts of a company's activities and its product or its service on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, namely the economy, society, and the environment. Mm-hmm. That was the first decade of the 21st century. In the second decade, we started appreciating as well that those three critical dimensions were having impacts on the limited liability companies around the world, which is the most important citizen in both developed and developing countries, because it is the medium through which business is conducted, capital is raised, jobs are created.
Sure.
And serves a great purpose to society. And we learned that the economy, for example, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, had a huge impact on companies. From a social point of view, the pandemic, the coronavirus, health and safety, huge impact on the company. And environmentally, I just have to say climate change. You can see how the environment impacts on a company. So enterprise value creation thinking started about 9 years ago.
Yes.
And now I've been involved in the International Financial Reporting Standards, which is a global body that operates in 144 countries around the world, setting standards with rigor and consistency on financial reporting.
Yeah.
They have now agreed to expand their mandate to include the so-called non-financial aspects, and are going to establish by November this year the Sustainability Standards Board, which will look at sustainability. So it's like a coin, it's got two sides, the impacts which a company has on those three dimensions, but those three dimensions have an impact on the company. And the Sustainability Standards Board will be looking at it through an enterprise value creation lens.
Yeah.
And I am involved in a new body called the Value Reporting Foundation, which will set, hopefully, standards, hopefully the whole world, because what we really need, the end game, and my vision, is to have a comprehensive corporate reporting system which really starts changing behavior of corporate leaders. And hopefully we have a consistent one around the world. The fact that you and I can talk to each other as we are now,
Sure.
just shows how connected the world is.
Yes.
And really we should have one standard of financial reporting and so-called non-financial reporting, and then connect them with integrated reporting, which was something that I was a founder of some 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
That's
a bit
exciting.
of a long answer to your question, but yes, I'm very involved with what's happening globally.
That's wonderful. And perhaps, Mervyn, if you could just expand a little and perhaps share for people how the definition has changed in terms of company value from the days where we would simply measure net asset value on a balance sheet in terms of economic value to how the current way, what is the current measurement and how should directors of companies be measuring value today?
Well, you're quite correct that the test for success was increased profit, increased share price, increased dividends. Those are the three criteria. Never mind that it was being subsidized by society and the environment, and we had a century of unsustainable development. So the measurement today is the company actually creating value for society? That's the measurement.
Yes.
And if it's how the questions that should be asked today is how has the company made its money?
Yes.
Because if it's made its money on a basis of an adverse impact on the environment, then looked at holistically, it's probably reducing value for society. And it's an instrument created by society, for society, this artificial incapacitated person, the company. And its leaders are the conscience and mind of the company. So we have to think differently from the primacy of the shareholder and profit at any cost to, in a resource-constrained world, and with climate change happening as you and I are speaking, that we have to think of success as adding value to society.
Of course, of course. And in that context, I know, so much of the work you've done also addresses the issue of what is the role of company director and what are the critical aspects of leadership. So if we separate those two points, in your view, what are the duties of the director?
Well, a director individually and as a collective, because when the board makes a decision, it's a collective mind, owes its duties of good faith, care, skill, and diligence to the company, this incapacitated artificial person. that's so critical to society and has no mind, no heart, no soul,
Yes.
and no conscience. I
Yes.
call it the innocent company.
Okay.
Because when something goes wrong, the wrath of society turns against the company, but it should really turn against its corporate leaders
Yes.
who have made through negligence or some reason, made a business judgment call which is really adverse to the environment, for example. So the critical thing for leadership, first of all, is courage. And you've got to have courage because as a director, you're putting your personal reputation and your personal estate on the line because you could be sued for making the wrong business judgment call, hence the business judgment rule.
Yeah.
You've got to cross what I call the intellectual Rubicon. You've got to leave behind your present needs, your past experiences, and cross that Rubicon to actually become the mind of this incapacitated person and only think of what's in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. Because if you get that right, it's in the long-term best interest of all its stakeholders. And you know, the Business Roundtable in America a year ago said, thinking only the primacy of the shareholder, we cannot carry on like that anymore. We have to take account of the interest of all stakeholders.
Yes.
Well, they never intended, in my judgment, to say that directors must make decisions in the best interest of stakeholders. Hence this phrase of stakeholder capitalism I abhor, because it seems to replace the era of corporate leaders focusing on one stakeholder, the shareholder, to acting in the interests of all stakeholders. Now, if a director of a company lets the company meet the interests and expectations of all stakeholders, for example, increased wages for employees, as an example, at 20% per annum, for example, well, the company will go bankrupt.
Yes.
So there are trade-offs between the stakeholders, but you need to learn and understand the needs, interests, expectations, and the tribulations during the pandemic. And so a year ago, I coined the word coronanomics because I said we, as corporate leaders, are sailing our companies through a sea of economic crisis and a viral crisis. You can't separate the two because to try and contain the virus, we've had restrictions and lockdowns, and that's exacerbated weak economies at the time. South African economy was certainly weak. American economy was in some turmoil, I'd say. And it exacerbated the situation. So I coined the word coronanomics, that you've got to understand that you're steering your companies for survival. So it's a lot of short-term thinking, but you cannot discharge your duty of care and not think long-term and still plan when we move from survive mode to thrive mode, and we will in a couple of years' time, I'm sure.
Yes.
Economies will turn, and but you, me, I, the directors, the corporate leaders have to get the company ready for that survival mode. Yet now, we have to have a mindset which I've called collaborative under SDG 17.
Yes.
Integrated, thinking the symphony of the resources used by a company in its relationship with its stakeholders. Compromising, because we have to compromise with our stakeholders who've gone through hardships. But the stakeholders likewise have to realize the company has suffered hardships. So there's got to be this compromising mindset short term to make sure the company survives, because if it doesn't, will human capital be dispersed? The infrastructure will be sold at knockdown prices in the present market conditions. And when we get to survive mode, to try and recreate that company will be virtually impossible. So, but if you get it to survive and just keep that human capital together and the intellectual capital together and everything, when you get back to survive mode, you can start really building it up again. So it's interesting that you've got to think short term, but you cannot stop planning long term. I wrote a book in 2016 together with Jill Atkins, who's professor of accountancy at Sheffield University. Called the Chief Value Officer. What I said was, and the International Federation of Accountants, housed in America, has said they agree with Professor King, because what I said was that to call the accountant chief financial officer actually become a misnomer, because he or she doesn't sit in a corner office in Boston drafting the financial statements of a company operating in Boston according to US GAAP.
Yeah.
Doesn't. He or she is looking at this whole value creation process, which we set out in the IR, the Integrated Reporting Framework, that their inputs into a company, and we say there's 6 resources. There's human capital, intellectual capital, financial capital, manufactured capital, social capital, and natural capital. These are things which every company uses. And there's the relationship between the company and stakeholders. So one needs this symphony. And you need collaboration. And I think what has happened in 2020, the pandemic, drove a miraculous collaboration of scientists to develop a vaccine.
Yes.
Which usually took 5 to 7 to 8 years. We did it in 9 months.
Yeah.
And that change of mindset to collaborate, America with the UK with Spain, wherever it was.
Yes.
We collaborate. Scientists here in South Africa were collaborating with Oxford and the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example.
Yes.
So this collaborative mindset, I think, has spread into the corporate world. And I think Mr. Mandela certainly thought on a collaborative basis. If you remember when we, South Africa, won the Rugby World Cup,
yes,
he made a point of putting on the jersey of the South African captain.
Yes.
And that was an act of collaboration to show that we were a united family in South Africa. Well, there have been developments since, which unfortunately is not too happy. But certainly Mr. Mandela had this collaborative mindset and was very conscious, of the unification of a people that were very divided under apartheid, as you will remember, Anne.
Of course. So I know you've had a couple of wonderful Mandela moments. I know you were part of that group of 12 who had lunch with him shortly after he came out of prison. I know you got that famous phone call where he said, hello, is this my favorite judge? So I thought if you could just share with us, those 2 moments, the lunch, perhaps take us through that first. How significant was that, and how did that?
Well, yeah, it was. I tell you, I was asked in 1992 by the Institute of Directors, because of my experience as a corporate lawyer and having been a judge and resigned as a matter of conscience, it's not relevant here. And then many of my clients asked me to go on their boards, and I ended up as chairman of companies listed in London, and Europe, and South Africa. So I had not only an academic knowledge of corporate law and accounting principles, but I'd done it. I'd practiced it, and I'm covered in corporate scars as a result.
Yeah.
And so I think for all those reasons, they asked me, would I form a committee and write guidelines for the majority of my fellow citizens who had not been in the mainstream of the economy because of the apartheid legislation. They were now coming in on a basis of equality, and they had nothing to guide them as to how to direct and how to manage.
Yes.
And I said, let me think about it, because I was very busy at the time. I was chairman of some large companies, and I got a call from Mr. Mandela, who, as usual, was prescient. He started discussing with me the education system in South Africa.
Yes.
And while he was on the phone, I said, Mr. Mandela, while I have you on the phone, I've had this approach. What do you think? Should I do it? And he said, do it. You're the right man.
Yes.
And make sure anybody who comes on your committee does it in the best interest of South Africa, Inc., and they don't receive any payment. They do it for nothing. They do it for the heart of South Africa.
That's
exactly what I did. I formed the committee, and you can look at the 4 reports. You can look at who's who of my committee. I've had the best of South Africa on my committees, and no one, including me, has ever charged a penny for the thing we've done. Mm-hmm. And that was the inspiration of Mr. Mandela.
Absolutely. But you also alluded to something quite important. And I know that when you resigned as a judge of the Supreme Court, under a former Prime Minister, Mr. P.W. Botha. It was an act of conscience. I think when we talk about some of the challenges in the world today and issues of conscience, I'm curious to know, what was that matter of conscience and what gave you the fortified courage to make that decision?
Well, first of all, I called for a commission of inquiry into the conduct of certain of my brother judges. And I asked it to be public. And unfortunately, to have it public over judges, you need both houses of parliament to agree.
Yes.
And to this day, I've never forgiven Helen Suzman for agreeing that it should not be public. It should be private and not disclosed. Mm-hmm. So in terms of that ruling, I cannot tell you the content of it. All I can tell you, I was unhappy with the conduct of some of my brother judges, and I didn't want to sit on the bench with them. And the inquiry was held and certain consequences followed from it. Mm-hmm. But it involved a question of ethics, and mm-hmm. And it was something that was very uppermost in my mind, and so I applied that feeling of doing the right thing and not being it takes courage to stand up to something like that, and
it does.
And I, with that sort of courage on my sleeve, I then went into a world where I also wasn't happy the way companies were being directed, and so I started my governance world.
Yes.
And the rest of the story, you know.
Yeah, and in that vein, I mean, what did you draw on to help you make that decision, a tough decision? I mean, there must have been considerations of risks and losses, you know.
Absolutely.
What did you draw on in that moment?
What I drew on was what was the right thing to do, mm-hmm. and what could I continue mm-hmm. sitting on the bench with a fellow judge who allegations were made, mm-hmm. not proven, but there were allegations made. All I wanted was for it to be inquired into and get it out in the open, and whatever the consequences were. And as I said, unfortunately, both houses of parliament agreed it should be private and never disclosed. And but there were consequences, and but I just felt it was the right thing to do. I couldn't bring myself to continue in that position, and I then consequently applied that mindset to the positions I held as director and chairman and of the many non-profit organizations. And I'm professor at the moment at the Wits Business School, so I'm applying my mind there too.
Yes.
And I've started the Chief Value Officer course at the School of Accounts at Wits, the first in the world, but there's a university in France that's following.
That's
a couple
wonderful.
in the UK, and because I've said that it's a misnomer to call an accountant a chief financial officer. He or she deals with this whole value creation process today. And I've seen as an advisor in C-suites that the accountant is the true change maker, because he or she has this organizational ability, is a steward of business information, and has skills of public interest training. So they can adapt to this change of mindset from profit at any cost to value creation as adding value to society.
Yeah. Just going back to your courage again, I mean, you really stand out as one of South Africa's beacon of hope, actually, in terms of making those tough decisions. What advice or what takeaways would you give to other people sitting in corporate boardrooms, knowing that there are questions of ethics? What advice would you give to them in terms of general takeaways about how to deal with that decision and how to make that tough call?
When you die, you only have one asset.
Yes.
And that is how you've lived your life and your reputation. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. And think about that when you're making decisions. Think about that when you're making choices. And so I believe that it's important and to do what is the right thing. And,
yes.
And your stomach sort of tells you sometimes more than your mind, what is the right thing to do.
Yes.
And even though it's against your interest or your family's interest sometimes, you've got to do the right thing. And somehow people know what is the right thing, but they don't do it because it does have consequences because you make a choice.
Of course.
And it takes courage to do the right thing. I mean, it's whistleblowers sometimes can never find another job in society because companies think they're troublemakers inside companies.
Yeah.
And I'm pressing globally for sort of universal whistleblowing legislation where governments actually say whistleblowers are heroes of society, heroines. No legislation says that. No legislation covering whistleblowing says people are encouraged to be whistleblowers.
Yes. And actually, we've seen that research in America as well, too, that there is an aversion to whistleblowers. To your point, it's hard for them to get a position again. And they're almost viewed as, traitors in a way. It raises an important question around leadership in the boardrooms around the world, in terms of, in your opinion, how do you think we move boardrooms and we move chairmen of boards and stakeholders, particularly shareholders who have a lot of influence, as we know, how do we get them to redefine how we measure and reward and punish, directors for their conduct, whether, reward good conduct and punish, if you like, wrongdoing?
Well, I think, the best driver of that is remuneration. We have a huge inequality gap in America, South Africa, all over the world.
Yes.
The earnings at the top, the turn at the top, well earned. The beat of the feet at the bottom.
Yes, I love that.
Huge gap. Huge gap.
Yes.
So what do? The right thing to do is lower the salary of the executive, increase the wages of the worker, but from a bonus point of view, make it variable. What does that mean? Well, there are three factors. It's context in which companies operate. They operate in the context of the environment, the economy, and society.
Yes.
So, Mr. Chief Executive, you're budgeting to increase the bottom line of the company by 7% next year. If you exceed it, you'll get 1/3 of your bonus.
Yes.
These were the adverse impacts on the environment in the last financial year. How are you going to eradicate or ameliorate those in the year ahead? Give me 5 targets, please.
Yes.
Gives you those 5 targets. And at the end of the year, you measure against those targets. If he hasn't achieved that, he loses 1/3 of his bonus. If he's achieved that, he gets another 1/3 of his bonus. The same thing, you look at what the adverse impacts were on society. Give me 5 targets or 7 targets, whatever it is. How are you going to eradicate or ameliorate that? If you achieve that, and his salary is $1.2 million a year, but he then earns $10 million.
Yes.
Well, it's very palatable to society because what has he done? By eradicating those adverse impacts, he's added value to society.
Of course.
It's so if you take a country like Ghana, for example, where US aid is quite prolific.
Yes.
The US aid will arrive. It may slip through the fingers of a politician. It may arrive for the X purpose, it's used for the Y purpose. But if every company in Ghana acted on that basis, every executive was remunerated on that basis, you would be adding value to society of much greater reward to that society and benefit to that society than merely handouts.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And related to that, we have seen many examples in South Africa and around the world where, chief executives perhaps have acted improperly. Very often there's what we call, the golden handshake, where there's a non-disclosure agreement. They paid out multi-millions, which is, shareholders' money. What are your thoughts around that?
The company's money.
Sorry?
The company's money. The company's money.
Yes. What is your view on that? And how do we, because in a way, this improper conduct is being rewarded. We can think of many examples of chief executives who've walked away with incredibly, massively large settlements. What are your thoughts on that, Mervyn?
Well, and their non-disclosure agreements and their non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah.
I can understand a non-disclosure agreement where there's confidential information given to you, and you asked, please sign this, that you will not disclose this because it's very confidential, but we need your expertise on this issue.
Yeah.
I can understand that.
Yes.
But to sign a non-disclosure agreement because you don't want people to know that you've actually rewarded an executive that's committed a wrong, but it's easier to settle than to face some investigation or a probe by the SEC or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So you settle with the executive and he gets paid a sum of money.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a non-disclosure agreement by the company and the executive.
Mm-hmm.
Now that to me is questionable, because what you're saying is, we're not sure it will be acceptable to all stakeholders. So we say you can't disclose what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Why not? Why can't you just disclose it?
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, there are non-disclosure agreements. There are two sides to that, to an NDA.
Mm-hmm. And what would you advise boards? I mean, to break this cycle, because, I've seen this, having run one of the top executive search firms in South Africa, I've seen this play out, numerous times. How do we break that cycle to bring back the principles of our revered constitution around transparency, honesty, equity for all, and as you say, it's the company's money. How do we break that cycle? What do we do? What are the kind of three things boards could do differently?
Well, I've applied my mind to that question. And so 2 years ago, I started the Good Governance Academy, because traveling around the world, as I used to now, I Zoom around the world.
Yes.
But lecturing and talking and advising companies around the world. I've lectured in Boston. I've worked with Boston College. I've worked with Harvard. I've worked with Oxford. I've worked with Monash in Australia, all over the world.
Yes.
And what I learned was that not every university teaches, for example, accountancy on the same basis. And I mentioned Monash because I invite you to Google Monash University dating an accountant.
Yes.
What Professor McGeegan did was he got 6 accountants, and he got an attractive lecturer from the arts department, an attractive lady lecturer from the music department to date an accountant, and he secretly filmed this dinner, and afterwards disclosed, of course, that it had been filmed. Yeah. And you see a discussion on the topic, and the accountant raises something, and he keeps returning to this sort of tunnel discussion,
Yeah.
And so Professor McGeegan has edited these dinners, and it's fascinating to watch this video. And as a result, he changed the curriculum, and he said AI will actually do the debits and credits. You'll press a button, get a balance sheet every day if you like.
Yes.
But accountants should really become the advisors, and I agreed with him, because I wrote the book Chief Value Officer. That really, you've got to apply your mind as an advisor. So one of the critical subjects is philosophy, because it makes you think laterally. And to apply your mind to be a true advisor and a true change maker in the C-suite, to get companies thinking. And therefore, I also became chairman of the Conscious Company. launched the Conscious Company in South Africa, and the Conscious Companies Awards. Is your company seen to be a responsible corporate citizen? Are you a responsible corporate citizen? Are you a conscious company? Well, it's going to depend on the consciousness of its corporate leaders.
Of course.
So I started the GGA, and all I can tell you, Anne, within 2 years, I've got the great institutions around the world agreed, and I have 2 colloquia a year where, for example, on the 13th of May, we're discussing enterprise value creation, preservation, and erosion.
Yes.
And I have 4 international speakers, which I've got to speak on the subject. I and my chief executive do a summary of those 4, and we send it to our support members, which includes the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, for example, the International Federation of Accountants in America. And our last one went to 4.5 million practicing accountants, directors in 69 countries.
That's wonderful. What a wonderful initiative. What do you think Nelson Mandela would say to the business community today? And of course, America's had a lot of turmoil, as you know, many countries around the world. But what do you think he would say to American corporate leaders and to corporate leaders generally?
Well, I think he would say, let's go back in time to the middle of the 19th century when in the UK and in Boston, strangely enough, there were thoughts of, wealthy families don't want to give risk capital anymore to unlimited liability entities, because when they went bankrupt, they were still liable to the creditors and the employees. And they said, why don't we create a statutory person? We will create a person that has limited liability. So we will make it a shares. You'll get a share of the business of the company, and we create a share. You get equity capital rather than risk capital. And that's the end of your duty and responsibility to the company. Mr. Shareholder, you have no further duty or responsibility. In consequence, when the company goes bankrupt or there's something goes wrong, you're going to be at the back of the line before all the creditors and everybody. That's the concomitant for the protection of limited liability.
Yes.
And it became the springboard for the creation of jobs and the raising of capital. And so the company became very important, but the purpose of the company was to serve society.
Yes.
It wasn't to enrich shareholders. It wasn't to make shareholders. And the theory was increase wealth at the top and it would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. The trickle, as I've said many times around the world, became treacle, and it stuck at the top. It never came down to the impoverished. So go back. If Nelson Mandela were here today and I was talking to him, I'd say to Mr. Mandela, tell companies to go back to their purpose for why they were founded. At that time, Lord Thurlow in the United Kingdom, the theologians were very opposed to the creation of an artificial person.
Yes.
Lord Thurlow, the great theologian of the day, said, who are we as mankind? It was mankind in those days, not humankind. Who are we as mankind to create a person? Only Almighty God can create a person. And we're creating a person that has no conscience, has no body to be kicked, no mind to be damned. He was right, the theologian. We lost sight of that. And that this artificial person was created by society, for society. It was used as an instrument to create wealth for certain individuals.
I mean, that's such an important point. When we think of how, our beloved Madiba, as we called him, really served with purpose to transform, a system of apartheid into a world respected modern democracy. What do you think corporate leaders need to do to arm themselves with that kind of purpose-driven life?
Well, it's interesting that Chad Halliday, who was the chairman of Bank of America, chairman of Shell, and I had a fireside chat about 2 months ago.
Yes.
The question of transitioning Shell from a fossil fuel company to a renewable energy company. Well, one cannot do it overnight. You cannot just turn the taps off of the oil rigs, for example. And the reason, Anne, is that Shell, BP, and all those companies are major holdings in your pension fund and pension funds around the world.
Of course.
You would suddenly, if you closed it now, you'd have a huge hole in your pension fund, and you also wouldn't get the dividends.
Yes.
So your pension fund would actually reduce by millions, and also your earnings in your pension fund would decrease. So if you had already retired, your retirement value you'd get out of your pension fund would be diluted and would be decreased. So one has to accept that you've got to transition these things, taking into account the interests of all the stakeholders.
Yes.
And you've got to realize there are trade-offs between them, such as in Europe, there are directives now about, I think by 2035, you can't have plant and machinery that's driven by fossil fuel. So you've got to be driven by renewables.
Mm-hmm.
So some companies have actually taken the decision not to pay dividends for the next 2-3 years.
Yeah.
So not to affect the debt equity ratio of the company, not to have the extra cash to move from fossil fuels to renewables. And one would think the share price would go down.
Yes. But it's
not a
gone
case.
up.
The share price has gone up.
Yeah.
Because BlackRock has said, here's a board that actually applied its collective mind to the long-term health of the company.
Of course, of course.
Longevity. And I can invest in this company for the benefit of my beneficiaries, of which some I've got to pay out in 30 years' time.
Yes, of course. And of course, you make the important point about having an investment impact investment community that also support those values. So, that's obviously quite an important participant in this as well. In our final couple of minutes left, we know how much Mandela also loved the youth and children and how much he missed the youth while he was in prison. What do you think, briefly, he would say to the rising young stars in the world today, the young leaders?
Well, he would say to them, I would hope what I'm saying to them, you've got to be conscious leaders. Mm-hmm. And you've got to appreciate, if you're going to be a corporate leader, and I think we're talking about corporations here. Yeah. If you're going to be a corporate leader, you've got to be a conscious corporate leader. You've got to be aware that you're acting for an incapacitated person.
Yes.
I'm always fascinated about Mr. Skilling, for example, in that famous case, Enron.
Yeah.
Would he have done what he did as a guardian of a 5-year-old incapacitated child?
It's a good question.
And he said he was a great churchgoer and everything. He would never have done what he did to a company. And yet this company is more critical to society than that 5-year-old child because it's the most important citizen in the United States of America.
Yes.
And you need to deal with it on a basis of conscience to make sure that that company is actually adding value to society and not being subsidized by society and the environment. I'm afraid that's what we've done, and consequently, our planet is in crisis.
It is. So to the point around the youth, it's how do we inspire our youth, educate our youth, inculcate those values.
And the purpose of my GGA is I'm educating the educators to make sure they teach young people all this thought leadership that's coming out from around the world, which I've garnered and I've put into this Good Governance Academy.
That's wonderful. Well, I'd love to, we could carry on chatting for ages, but I'd love to talk to you about that some other time because, I think we share a common passion there. But before we close off, just any final thoughts about leadership in the world today in the 21st century and any lessons from South Africa's iconic Nelson Mandela?
Well, I think the important lesson is to know the difference between intellectual honesty and honesty. I mean, it's very clear that if you and I are directors of a company, we wouldn't steal the company's motor car and give it to our children.
Yes.
And yet, from an intellectually dishonest point of view, we will change the detail of a transaction so it benefits our cousin, for example.
Yes.
So intellectual honesty is you've got to leave aside past experiences, present needs. You've got to forget who nominated you. You've got to forget that because you might be nominated by the most important company in America, and suddenly your first board meeting, you're called upon to make a decision which could be adverse to the interest of your nominator.
Yes.
Well, you've got to have the courage here, because the courage comes in. You've got to have the courage, but that intellectual honesty. I am acting for an incapacitated artificial person. Mm-hmm. I am the mind, soul, the heart, and the conscience of this company. What is the right answer for the long-term health of this incapacitated person? And that's it.
You've always been an incredible inspiration, not only to me, but to millions around the world. I thank you for your heart and soul and conscience and courage and very sharp mind. And thank you so much for being with us today. I look forward to reconnecting with you soon. Bless you.
Thank you.
Our conversation with former Supreme Court Judge Mervyn King reveals radical new thinking, a new brand of capitalism, a confirmation that trickle-down economics does not work. Profit, like treacle, sticks at the top. There is a new purpose for business, no longer simply to enrich shareholders, instead to create shared value for multiple stakeholders and to serve society. While fossil fuel companies cannot transition overnight, those in Europe with directives to transition to renewable energy by 2035 who have paused their dividend payout to pay for this transition have seen their share price rise, not fall. There is a new role for the Chief Financial Officer, no longer the chief number cruncher who simply counts the money. Instead, we have a Chief Value Officer, a person who can help focus the organization, create shared value, and deliver sustainable impact. A philosophical advisor who measures not only profit or a single bottom line, instead measures a triple bottom line of a company's performance and impact on profit, people, and planet. We have a new brand of company director to replace the corrupt corporate symbols of shame. People who understand that they are the heart, the mind, the soul, and the conscience of a company. The good news is, you too can boldly reimagine capitalism. Where do you choose to work? Where do you choose to shop? Or what kind of company you choose to create? So until next time, remember, leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices, and bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, one giant step for humanity. So sign up, share with your friends, and join this global Mandela leadership movement for change. The world needs you to lead boldly too. Take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, Sign up on ann-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.